For decades, Iran invested enormous resources into something it believed would guarantee its security forever. Deep beneath the mountains, engineers carved out massive underground tunnel networks. Entire military cities were hidden below layers of rock and concrete. Inside those tunnels were ballistic missiles, launch systems, ammunition depots, command centers, and thousands of military personnel. These underground complexes were not just bases, they were symbols of deterrence. Iranian leaders believed the mountains themselves would act as shields against any air strike. The concept was simple: bury the weapons deep enough and no enemy could destroy them. But modern warfare has changed. In recent years, technological advances in satellite intelligence, bunker-penetrating weapons, and electronic warfare have rewritten the rules of military strategy. What once looked like an impenetrable fortress can quickly turn into a trap when the environment around it collapses. According to multiple defense analysts, a major operation targeted some of the most important underground missile facilities in western and northern Iran. These bases were believed to house long-range ballistic missiles and serve as critical launch hubs for Iran's regional deterrence strategy. Among the most significant complexes were the underground installations located near Khorramabad in Lorestan province and another large tunnel system in East Azerbaijan province. Both sites had been developed over many years at enormous cost, and both were deeply integrated into Iran's strategic missile infrastructure. The Khorramabad complex, sometimes referred to as the Imam Ali facility, was one of the largest underground missile bases ever constructed in the region. Reports suggested that its tunnel system stretched for dozens of kilometers through the mountains. Inside those corridors were missile storage chambers, concealed launch areas, and logistical depots designed to keep the entire system functioning during prolonged conflict. From the outside, these mountains looked ordinary, but beneath the surface existed a labyrinth designed to survive almost anything. That assumption would soon be tested. The operation that targeted these facilities relied heavily on a combination of intelligence, electronic warfare, and long-range bombing capabilities. Before any bombs were dropped, the first phase focused on disabling surveillance and early warning systems. Air defense networks depend on radar coverage and communication links to detect threats. If those systems are disrupted, the entire defense structure can become blind. Cyber operations and electronic warfare units reportedly work to overwhelm radar networks and disrupt communication channels. In modern conflict, this digital phase often happens long before the first aircraft arrives. When those systems went dark, a window of vulnerability opened in the airspace. Strategic bombers were then deployed to exploit that moment. Among the aircraft involved were some of the most iconic bombers ever built. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber is designed specifically for penetrating heavily defended airspace. Its radar-evading shape allows it to approach targets that would normally be protected by advanced air defenses. Carrying massive bunker-penetrating weapons, these aircraft can deliver strikes capable of reaching deeply buried structures. When a bunker-buster bomb hits its target, the physics involved are brutal. The weapon uses extreme speed and weight to punch through layers of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating. The explosion then sends shockwaves through the surrounding structure, cracking foundations and collapsing internal corridors. For underground facilities, the damage is not always limited to the initial explosion. Structural stress can trigger secondary collapses, fires, and chain reactions inside ammunition depots. Once the initial strikes opened the way, additional bombers moved into the operational zone. The B-1 Lancer, a supersonic bomber known for its speed and heavy payload, can strike multiple targets rapidly. Its role often includes destroying mobile defenses or critical infrastructure that supports the main target. Following that, B-52 Stratofortress bombers entered the operation. Despite first flying in the early 1950s, the B-52 remains one of the most powerful strategic bombers in existence. Its ability to carry enormous quantities of precision-guided weapons makes it ideal for sustained bombardment once air defenses have been neutralized. Instead of stealth, the B-52 relies on altitude, range, and sheer payload capacity. It can deliver wave after wave of guided munitions against infrastructure targets. In operations like this, the strategy often involves layered destruction. First, precision weapons strike the most hardened structures. Then follow-up strikes destroy ventilation shafts, communication systems, power lines, and entrances. Without those support systems, underground facilities become extremely difficult to operate. Ventilation systems are essential for any deep underground installation. Without airflow, smoke and toxic gases can accumulate rapidly after explosions. Electricity is equally important. Elevators, communication systems, lighting, and control equipment all depend on stable power. Once those lifelines are cut, even undamaged sections of a tunnel network can become isolated. Satellite monitoring systems reportedly detected intense heat signatures in the targeted areas following the strikes. Such signals can indicate fires, ammunition detonations, or structural collapses occurring beneath the surface. Underground facilities are particularly vulnerable to chain reactions when ammunition depots ignite. Stored rockets, propellants, and explosives can trigger massive secondary blasts that ripple through the tunnel network. When this happens inside confined spaces, the pressure waves become even more destructive. For the personnel stationed in these facilities, the situation could quickly become chaotic. Deep underground, communication with the surface is essential. If external antennas and relay stations are destroyed, those below may not even know the full scale of what is happening above them. In such conditions, information becomes scarce and confusion spreads rapidly. Military planners have long debated whether large underground bases are an advantage or a vulnerability. On one hand, they offer protection from conventional airstrikes. On the other hand, if entrances collapse or life support systems fail, the same protective structure can become a trap. Throughout history, fortified positions have sometimes suffered this fate. When supply routes are cut and exits blocked, even the strongest fortress can become impossible to sustain. The strategic consequences of destroying or disabling major missile complexes extend far beyond the immediate damage. Ballistic missile forces are often designed around specific launch infrastructure. If those launch hubs are disrupted, the ability to coordinate missile operations can decline dramatically. Defense officials have indicated that missile launch activity decreased significantly following the reported strikes. Drone activity was also reduced during the same period. Such changes can alter the strategic balance within a conflict zone. Iran's broader military doctrine has long relied on missile capabilities as a central pillar of deterrence. By developing large stockpiles of missiles and dispersing them across multiple underground sites, the country sought to ensure that it could respond to threats even after absorbing an initial strike. This concept is sometimes referred to as survivable deterrence. However, survivability depends not only on physical protection, but also on operational flexibility. If infrastructure becomes too rigid or concentrated, it may be more vulnerable than expected. Modern surveillance systems, including satellites and high-altitude drones, now provide near-constant monitoring of strategic locations. Combined with precision-guided munitions, this level of observation makes it increasingly difficult to hide large installations. Technological asymmetry plays a huge role in this dynamic. Nations that can combine intelligence gathering, electronic warfare, and precision strikes gain a powerful advantage over opponents relying primarily on static defenses. The destruction or disabling of major missile infrastructure can therefore have ripple effects across the region. Iran has long supported allied groups and partners across the Middle East, often referred to collectively as the axis of resistance. These relationships depend partly on logistical support, training, and access to weapons systems. If key supply nodes or missile depots are compromised, those networks may face new challenges. Regional governments are closely watching how these events unfold. For years, many neighboring countries viewed Iran's missile arsenal as one of the most significant security threats in the region. Changes in that capability could influence diplomatic calculations, defense planning, and alliance structures. At the same time, the broader lesson from events like these extends beyond any single country. Military doctrines built decades ago are increasingly being tested by rapid technological change. What once seemed like an unstoppable defensive strategy can quickly become outdated when new weapons and intelligence systems appear. The idea of missile cities, buried deep beneath mountains, was designed for a different era of warfare. It assumed that physical depth alone could guarantee survival. But the combination of advanced sensors, cyber warfare, and precision strikes has altered that equation. In the modern battlefield, flexibility and adaptability may matter more than concrete and steel. And as military technologies continue evolving, the balance between offense and defense will keep shifting in ways that few strategists can fully predict. The events surrounding these underground facilities serve as a powerful reminder that even the most ambitious military projects can face unexpected challenges when confronted by new forms of warfare. For most wars in history, the battlefield has been obvious. It's where the soldiers fight, where tanks advance, where artillery echoes across the horizon. But in the war between Russia and Ukraine, the most important battlefield may not be the front line at all. It may be thousands of kilometers away, hidden inside factories, laboratories, and industrial complexes deep inside Russia. For years, these facilities formed the backbone of Russia's war machine. Massive production centers building missiles, kamikaze drones, and advanced strike systems. Weapons that would eventually travel across the continent before raining down on Ukrainian cities. Night after night, power stations destroyed, energy grids collapsing, cities plunged into darkness. Russia's strategy was brutally simple. As long as the factories kept running, the war could continue indefinitely. And for a long time, those factories seemed completely untouchable. They were located far from the front lines, buried inside Russia's vast territory, protected by distance, air defenses, and the assumption that Ukraine simply didn't have the reach to strike them. Meanwhile, Western allies debated how far they were willing to go. Long-range weapons for Ukraine were delayed again and again. Political red lines slowed decisions that might have changed the battlefield earlier. Moscow understood this hesitation. And while those debates continued, Russia's military industry worked around the clock. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. More drones, more missiles, more ammunition. The war machine never stopped. But something else was happening quietly inside Ukraine. Instead of waiting endlessly for new weapons from abroad, Ukrainian engineers and military planners started building something of their own. Long-range strike systems, domestically produced missiles capable of traveling thousands of kilometers. Weapons designed for a completely different kind of strategy. Not just fighting the enemy on the battlefield, but attacking the system that feeds the battlefield. Once those weapons were ready, Ukraine changed its approach. Instead of focusing only on Russian troops and tanks, Ukrainian forces began targeting the factories themselves. Drone production centers, missile testing ranges, massive ammunition depots, facilities that had been operating safely since the beginning of the war suddenly became targets. And when the first strikes hit, the message was clear. Distance was no longer protection. Explosions began appearing in regions of Russia that had never expected to see war. Industrial buildings burned. Storage facilities erupted into massive fireballs. Entire complexes were forced to shut down. Some of these sites were responsible for producing the drones that Russia used in large numbers against Ukrainian cities. Others were key locations for developing and testing advanced missile systems. When these facilities were damaged, the impact was immediate. Weapons production slowed. Testing programs were delayed. Supply chains began to fracture. And then came the next phase. Ukraine started targeting stockpiles. Large depots where thousands of drones, rockets, and artillery shells were stored before being sent to the battlefield. When one of these sites was struck, the explosions sometimes continued for hours. A single successful strike could destroy months of production in one night. Military analysts began describing the strategy as a three-layer attack. First, damage the factories that build the weapons. Second, destroy the stockpiles where those weapons are stored. Third, disrupt the logistics routes that deliver them to the front line. Together, these attacks created a powerful chain reaction inside Russia's military supply network. And the effects quickly began reaching the battlefield. With fewer drones and fewer missiles available, Russian forces faced growing limitations. Air support operations became harder to maintain. Missile strikes became less frequent. The constant flow of weapons that had once fueled Russia's offensive momentum started to slow. But the pressure didn't stop there. As damage mounted inside Russia's military industry, Moscow began searching for outside help. One of the first countries it turned to was North Korea. Large shipments of artillery shells and other ammunition reportedly began moving across rail routes toward Russia. On paper, these supplies looked like a solution. In reality, they created new problems. Reports from the battlefield suggested that some of the ammunition was unreliable. Certain shells malfunctioned. Others lacked accuracy or consistency. Instead of solving the shortage, these emergency supplies sometimes introduced new risks for the troops using them. At the same time, another key partner faced its own challenges. Iran had previously supplied large numbers of drones used by Russia. But growing regional tensions and internal pressures forced Tehran to prioritize its own defense needs. Drone shipments slowed dramatically. And then another obstacle appeared. China. Beijing had avoided directly supplying weapons to Russia, but Chinese companies had provided critical components used in manufacturing. Microchips, machine tools, electronic sensors. Many of the parts needed for modern missile and drone systems came from global supply chains connected to China. But Western sanctions began targeting financial institutions involved in supporting Russia's military industry. Banks faced a choice: continue facilitating transactions with Russia, or risk losing access to global financial markets. Many chose caution. Payments were blocked. Transactions refused. Suddenly, key components became much harder to obtain. For Russian factories, the impact was immediate. Without specialized electronics and sensors, certain production lines could not operate at full capacity. Missile manufacturing slowed. Drone assembly faced shortages. Some facilities even paused operations while searching for alternative suppliers. And once again, the consequences appeared on the battlefield. With supply chains under pressure and production slowing, Russia's ability to maintain constant firepower began to weaken. Ukraine recognized the moment. After years of grinding stalemate, Ukrainian forces began launching counterattacks along several sectors of the front. Positions that had remained static suddenly came under renewed pressure. Some defensive lines began to crack. Russian units were forced to reposition and withdraw from certain areas. But perhaps the most dramatic change was happening inside Russia itself. For the first time since the beginning of the full-scale war, air raid alarms began sounding in multiple Russian regions. Explosions and drone strikes were no longer distant events. They were happening at home. Residents who once believed they were far from danger suddenly found themselves rushing to shelters. Videos of explosions and fires spread rapidly across social media. Even when official media downplayed the events, the images circulating online told a different story. The war was no longer something happening somewhere else. It had reached Russian territory, and the psychological impact was significant, not only for civilians, but also for the country's economic elite. When major factories deep inside the country were struck, business leaders began questioning their own security. Some quietly moved assets abroad. Others began preparing contingency plans. At the same time, Ukraine expanded its strategy even further. Energy infrastructure became a new target. Refineries, fuel depots, oil processing facilities. These attacks didn't just affect military logistics. They targeted the economic foundation that funded the war itself. Damage estimates reached billions of dollars. Oil processing capacity dropped significantly. And for a country heavily dependent on energy exports, that loss carried enormous financial consequences. All of this created a difficult question for Moscow. How do you protect an industrial system spread across the largest country on Earth? One theoretical option would be to relocate key facilities deeper into remote regions and build heavily fortified underground factories. But such a project would require enormous investment, advanced engineering, and years of construction. At the same time, Russia's economy is already under pressure from sanctions and declining export revenues. Building a completely new network of protected military facilities would be extremely difficult. And even if new factories were built, another challenge remains. Modern surveillance, satellite monitoring, intelligence networks capable of tracking logistics movements in near real time. Weapons can sometimes be identified and targeted shortly after leaving the factory. This creates a dangerous cycle. Production resumes. Supply chains rebuild. Then new strikes destroy the progress. And the cycle begins again, which leads to the central strategic question of the conflict. Can Russia rebuild its military supply network faster than Ukraine can disrupt it? For now, Ukraine appears determined to keep the pressure constant. Using intelligence from Western allies, satellite imagery, and underground networks, Ukrainian planners continue identifying new targets. Whenever signs appear that production is restarting or supply routes are reopening, new strikes follow. Precision attacks, rapid operations, relentless pressure. Because in this war, victory may not depend only on what happens at the front line. It may depend on something much larger. The factories that build the weapons, the networks that transport them, and the economies that sustain the entire system. Modern warfare is no longer just about soldiers and territory. It is about industry, technology, and logistics. And the side that controls those systems may ultimately decide how the war ends. Behind the closed doors of power, the unity that the Iranian regime spent decades projecting to the world appears to be cracking in real time. What began as a political crisis is rapidly evolving into something much more dangerous: a power struggle between the civilian government and the military establishment. And now the entire region is watching closely. The moment that ignited this internal firestorm came when Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared unexpectedly on state television. In a shocking move, he publicly apologized to neighboring countries that had recently come under attack from Iranian forces. His message was direct and unprecedented. He expressed regret for the strikes carried out against regional states and attempted to reassure neighboring governments that Iran had no intention of continuing those attacks. For a brief moment, it looked like a diplomatic attempt to calm a rapidly escalating regional conflict. But inside Iran, the reaction was explosive. Instead of easing tensions, the apology triggered a political earthquake. Hardline factions within the regime immediately accused the president of betrayal. Powerful figures in parliament and the judiciary began openly attacking him, claiming that his words humiliated the country and weakened Iran in the eyes of its enemies. Within hours, accusations of treason began spreading across political circles and conservative media networks. What followed was something even more alarming. Despite the president's call for restraint, Iranian military forces and the Revolutionary Guard continued launching strikes across the region. Missiles and drones targeted infrastructure in Gulf countries, including areas linked to energy production and strategic facilities. The message from the military establishment seemed unmistakable. The president's authority was being ignored. For ordinary Iranians watching this unfold, the situation looked deeply chaotic. For years, the government had presented itself as a unified front against foreign pressure. Now, that image was collapsing in public view. Senior leaders were accusing each other of weakness and betrayal. The crisis deepened when the president attempted to walk back his earlier apology. Under enormous pressure, he issued a new statement insisting that Iran had not surrendered and would continue resisting its enemies. But the damage was already done. The original message had revealed something the regime had always tried to hide: uncertainty and division at the highest levels of power. International observers quickly noticed the moment of weakness. In Washington, former U.S. President Donald Trump responded with a blunt and highly provocative statement, describing Iran's apology as evidence that the country had been forced into submission after relentless pressure from the United States and Israel. His remarks were designed to strike directly at the regime's pride. And inside Iran, they had exactly that effect. Hardline factions became even more aggressive, insisting that any attempt at compromise would only embolden Iran's adversaries. While the political battle intensified, something else was happening on the ground. The United States began assembling one of the most powerful naval deployments the region had seen in years. Multiple aircraft carrier strike groups were positioned across the eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea, dramatically increasing American military presence near Iran's borders. The signal was unmistakable. Washington was preparing for the possibility of a much larger confrontation. To understand why the situation deteriorated so quickly, it's important to look closely at something the Iranian president revealed during his controversial speech. He hinted that many senior commanders had recently been killed in devastating strikes. According to his explanation, some military units had launched attacks without clear authorization because their leadership structure had been disrupted. For citizens listening at home, this statement was deeply unsettling. In effect, the president was admitting that parts of Iran's military were operating without central command. Missiles were being fired, while the country's leadership struggled to maintain control. This was not a message of strength. It was a warning sign that the state's chain of command was fracturing. Hardline politicians responded by doubling down. Several influential figures publicly declared that Iran had no limits when defending its national interests, and that attacks on regional targets would continue regardless of diplomatic pressure. In other words, the military and ideological factions within the regime were asserting their independence from the civilian government. Events soon proved them right. Shortly after the president's statement, explosions were reported at major regional infrastructure sites. Drones and missiles were intercepted across multiple Gulf countries, triggering air defense responses and emergency alerts. Air traffic disruptions occurred in one of the world's busiest aviation hubs after a drone incident near a major international airport. Regional governments quickly moved to strengthen their defenses. Saudi Arabia intercepted incoming aerial threats targeting strategic energy facilities. Bahrain activated emergency sirens. Jordan reported detecting numerous missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles passing through its airspace. The Middle East was suddenly on edge. Then came the first direct retaliation. One Gulf state launched a military strike against Iranian targets, describing it as a mirror response to previous attacks on its infrastructure. The targets reportedly included critical water purification and storage facilities, a sign that the conflict was expanding beyond purely military sites. Inside Iran, the pressure on the regime intensified.